Hey, how you doing?
Good. Can you hear me then?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of the work that you have been doing, and it's really an honor to have you on the platform today.
Not at all. I'm really happy and glad to talk to you.
Definitely, definitely. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
Okay, I'm Mrinalini Sinha. I'm a university professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I teach history, and I teach mainly British imperial history and colonial Indian history.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. Just to let you know, I'm currently in Ghana, and we're not as technologically advanced as back in the States. So if we, get a little static or disconnected, I'm still with you.
Uh,
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you this. When did you develop a passion for history? Was that something you kind of got into early on or later in life?
Kind of late in life, though, it's a long, circuitous route through which I got to history. So, my father was what I would call a unfulfilled historian. He really wanted to be a historian, loved history with a passion. But because of the circumstances in which he grew up, he needed to go get a job and earn money. And this was just during, actually, it was during World War II, and so he signed up to join the British Indian Army. And instead of, pursuing a career in academics and studying history. And so he was an army officer all his life, but continued with his passion for history. And so every morning when we were kids, I remember we would all sit down with my father and have long debates about history. He would tell us about historical events across the world. He'd read a lot and we'd debate a lot about all of it. All my siblings decided that they would study history, but I was a bit of a rebel. And instead of studying history, I decided to study English literature in college. And then after that, international politics. But I guess it was in my genes because after getting my master's in international politics, I decided to go back to history and I've never looked back since then. So I went on to do a master's and then a PhD, a second master's in history and then a PhD in history. And I am one of those who's a real convert to history.
Wow, that's really amazing. I mean, because, history can be so empowering. We can learn so much for history, and a lot of people take it for granted. But you were able to come up, in your childhood and have your dad share a lot of history with you. So obviously, he planted a major seed.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And you're right that it's such an important subject that people, like everyone I meet, just or in the public, and they'll say, history was the least favorite subject in class when I was in school. And I'd say, why is that? And they'd say, oh, history just meant learning facts, and that was it. And I feel so sorry for them because that's not what history is. And the real advantage that I had was, learning history from my father, for whom it was stories, and these incredibly interesting stories that would come alive and that would seem so important and worth debating in the present.
Yeah, yeah, you made a good point because, obviously a lot of us learn the history in the classroom, but I only can imagine learning it from your parents and, they're able to utilize things that you can relate to. Even if it's not at that moment later in life, you'll go back and say, wow, we really learned that from, our parents.
Absolutely. What brought you to history, Ty?
Man, I guess a similar situation in my family. A lot of like my great grandfather, he was in the Garveyite movement. He
Oh,
joined the UNIA, and my grandmother would tell me about it. And some of my uncles, they was in the Black Power movement of the '60s and stuff like that. So
so you grew up in the United States?
yeah, yeah, I'm from America. I just love traveling. I've been to about 70 countries, so I always wanted to go to Africa. I've been about 20 African countries, and I'm still going. So
Oh, lovely. Oh, great. So that's fantastic. Because my upbringing was in India, but a lot of the references that you're mentioning were very important for my father's generation of people. They were the people who grew up with, names like Marcus Garvey, like Du Bois, like, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. These were all names that meant something to them. They were part of this broader change that was happening across the world as old empires were being challenged.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. A lot of people don't know that. I think one of Garvey's top writers, one of his best writers for his newspaper, his global newspaper, was a man from India, so it's definitely a connection. Now, you a writer yourself, you an author.
Yes. So one of the things
Right.
about being a history PhD is that you have to write your dissertation, and most people who want a job in academia then end up also publishing their dissertation. So my first experience as an author of a book was my PhD dissertation that I published, which was about British colonial rule in India, in particular, looking at how the British attitudes towards educated Indians was, and how they tried to belittle and demean educated Indians because that they saw them as the real challenge to British rule, because these were the people who were often the ones who were representing the cause of the rest of the Indian people against the British. But then after that, I kind of continued my career as a writer and continued writing history, mainly for scholars, so mainly academic history. But I am now getting more and more interested in public history as well, as in writing histories that can be more widely available to a broader public.
Wow, wow. Okay, okay. Now, I was looking online, the colonial masculinity, is that what you're referring to, or is it a different one?
That was it. So one of the arguments in that book was that the British can, of course, they had a strong sense of racial difference with different groups of people, but they also were very smart in not having a simple white versus black thing, which was more common in the United States. But the British, because they ruled over such a vast multiracial empire, their way of exercising racial difference was never just white and black. They had a whole series of gradations, through which they ruled. And when it came to Indians, they initially, when they became colonial rulers in India, the British were actually much weaker than India economically, for example. So it's one of those odd things that is only through ruling India that Britain would become this big industrial power. So at that time, in the early years, they were much more interested, before they gained their power, they were much more interested in kind of seeming to be more and more like the Indian people. So one of the things they started asserting was the commonality, which is true. There was a commonality between Greek and Latin and Indian languages like Sanskrit. And from that developed this idea that the group of people who spoke this Proto Indo European language that gave rise to Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, that they must represent a single racial group. And that group they gave the name Aryans or Aryans, that Hitler would later use that term. That is actually a Sanskrit word which really means a good person. It's not a racial type. And the similarity in the languages didn't mean similar racial stock. But in the 19th century, a lot of people mistook the linguistic commonality with racial commonality. So then they started saying that the Indians were Aryans, just like the Europeans were, but that these were Aryans who had declined, degenerated because of the tropical climate. But since they were claiming a racial commonality with the Indians, it was very hard to use very simple racist stereotypes because they were saying we were the same racial stock originally. So instead, they found different ways of making racial distinctions. And one of the ways that they used against educated Indians, not against the majority of Indians, but against the class of educated Indians, was to say that you had degenerated and become effeminate, that you didn't want manly enough. So this is a very different kind of stereotype than you see, say, in the American South against black men, that you are too manly, you are macho, you cannot control your masculinity. While with the Indians, the point was that you guys have become too effeminate, you are not masculine enough. So I was exploring how that stereotype developed and how the British used that stereotype in various ways to both proclaim that, oh, we believe that we are the same race, we are not making any racial distinctions, we don't believe in making racial distinctions. But instead of making racial distinctions, they were then making, kind of putting it on this gender stereotype, that the reason you are not being given certain rights, or the reason you're not given certain positions, is because you're not manly enough, you're not masculine enough. So that's what I was exploring in the book.
Wow, wow, that is so interesting. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now I can ask you this because you wrote this in 1995, so that was maybe like 30 years ago, and I believe recently India has the largest population on earth. Do you feel like it's still a major effect of colonialism there, or have they kind of broken away from it, or
I mean, in some ways, both my answer to that would be yes and no. If you think of it in colonialism only in terms of political and economic control, I'd say yes, they've certainly broken away from it. And you can see that in the economic development of India after independence. It took a long time, probably didn't start really happening till the 1990s. But already after independence in 1947, you see that those long periods of famine that the British that happened in India during British rule, that was put in check. Literacy grew up, developed. People's per capita income increased. Economic self-sufficiency was achieved on a lot of fronts. So yes, economically there was a big difference between British rule and independence. Politically, big difference. There was no democracy under British rule. Very few people were given the right to vote towards the end of the British Empire. But India, all of a sudden, would do something absolutely unique, something that had never happened in any European country before, which was on one single day to give every adult universal franchise. So if you take the history of the United States, or take the history of Britain or France, people got the right to vote in stages. First, only white propertied men, then eventually black men, then eventually women. But yet, people were, especially if you take the history of the US, we have a history of also voter suppression among certain groups of people, especially among minorities. While in India in 1947, everybody, the poorest of the poor, got the right to vote. So those legacies of colonialism, India completely challenged and sort of developed a path of its own. But on other issues, the legacy of colonialism continues, and you can see that in certain cultural attributes, especially in terms of creating divisions between different groups of people. The independence movement tried to address that, especially under a leader like Gandhi. In India, the big division that the British used was not ethnic or tribal, as it's called in the African context, but mainly religious. So the Hindu Muslim division both continued at the time of independence and continues today. Certain ways of understanding identities, certain cultural practices, those are also legacies of colonialism that continue and that are much harder to overthrow than the more sort of uh, formal structural issues like political change and economic change.
oh, okay, okay. Now I wanted to ask you about I believe this is your second book. Is it Feminism and Internationalism?
That was a project that I did as a edited volume, with inviting lots of people to write in, and that was mainly an attempt to kind of highlight the work of feminism or womanism or whatever we want to call it from the global south, because a lot of our ideas about feminism still sort of are centered around the West, around, the Anglo American tradition in particular. We think most of it came from there. And sometimes men in the global South will also say that. So when women ask for rights in Ghana or in India or in Nigeria or wherever, or Malaysia, often the male political leaders will say, oh, this is a Western thing. This is not, from here. But this collection, Feminism and Internationalism, was to challenge those ideas and say that no, there were groups and women's activists, whether they use the name or not. I mean, the term itself is a new word that came into being only in the late 19th century, but they were doing similar things all over, and that we need to rethink this idea that feminism is a Western thing.
Wow, wow, that's a great point. That's a great point. That's a very interesting topic. Let me see. Now you had mentioned editing. You also have edited some works as well. What is the difference between actually writing a book and editing it?
Ah, very nice. So there are various ways in which you can edit. So the book you mentioned, Feminisms and Internationalism, in that I was an editor with two other people, and what we did is we wrote a program or an introduction of what we wanted in the book, and then we asked other people to take up different aspects of it and write chapters of the book. So then we have this big introduction, because obviously we can't be experts in every area, but we feel that this is a topic that is better together than separately. So we wanted to bring together scholars of, different parts, places in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and bring them together, and also in Europe and Americas, to kind of say, hey, what does feminism in the international mode look like? So that's one form of editing. But then there's another form of editing that I've also done, and that's in a book called Mother India, where there's an old book that was written by somebody, an American woman in the 1930s. I've called it Selections from Mother India. And you want to reprint that book by kind of both providing a better introduction that contextualizes the book, when it was written, why it was written, background of the author, the impact of the book, and also provide like notes about certain things in the book that she published that people today may not understand. So that would be another form of editing. So editing can be two forms. One is inviting other scholars to write essays, and then you publish that book and you write the introduction and you conceive of the project. Or you can take a previously published book in the past, and then you want to revive it or resurrect it by providing it with a better contextualizing introduction, notes, so that people can understand it. So that would be editing. But when you're an author of a book, then you're writing everything in it, meaning there's no other authors that you're inviting. There's no previous book that you are resituating, but you are writing everything in it.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Because I believe the average reader, they take for granted the role of an editor. Obviously, a lot of our favorite books would be totally different if it was a different editor. So I
Absolutely.
definitely appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now I can ask you. Now have you ever thought about doing like a documentary, maybe based on one of your books or some of your research or anything?
I am not so skilled on being able to do that. So unfortunately, I haven't done it. But there have been others who have used the book to do like brief documentaries. So there was, when my first book, Colonial Masculinity, came out, the BBC did a brief documentary in which they used a part of the book to kind of present the case of how colonialism in India used gender instead of race to make the distinction between different groups of people. And they took an episode from the book to kind of illustrate their documentary. I've done a few podcast talks, both with academics and non academics, but I've not done any documentaries.
Oh, okay. Wow. Because I mean, you got some very, very interesting subjects, so I could definitely see it, you know.
So that's
Mm.
that's something that you do, obviously, right? So you do a lot of podcasts and documentaries.
Yeah, yeah, I'm trying to get it. So I really appreciate what you're doing. Now I can ask you, are you working on any projects right now? Any books?
Yeah, I am. I am. So I'm working on a book which actually it might be of interest to you since you said you like to travel. This is a book about people in the colonial period in India who traveled all over. Some of them traveled because they were looking for work or they were escaping British surveillance, but some of them were forced to travel. So this was, after slavery the British abolished slavery in their colonies in the Americas and elsewhere. They still needed labor, and a lot of the plantation owners, they weren't willing to pay good wages for the former slaves to come back and work on the plantations. And I'm talking about places like Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, places like that. Also in the Pacific, in Mauritius and Fiji and colonies like that. They weren't paying enough money for the former enslaved people to say, okay, I'll come back and work on the plantation. So the British had to find some form of labor. So while they were ruling India and ruining the economy in India and creating, a lot of distress, especially in the rural areas, they were also kind of almost, and a lot of people use the term new system of slavery, almost forcing people into signing labor contracts to go and work in these plantations. Some of them were illiterate, so they were made to sign these contracts by just putting their thumbprints on it. They didn't even understand what was written on it. And they were forced to go work under very terrible conditions, often were carried in the same ships that carried slaves on the middle passage across the Atlantic. The very same ships were used to carry these Indian laborers. They were called coolies. So my project is to look at all these people who went out of India, both as coolies, as students, as revolutionaries, as ordinary workers, and look at what impact their travels had on the way they thought about India and the way they thought about colonialism, and how that would change the nature of anti colonialism in India.
Wow, wow, that's very interesting. A lot of people, will hear about slavery in the Americas, and then we'll even hear about sharecropping, but this is definitely a piece of history that we need to learn as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because the US actually was very particular in not one of the reasons the US sort of gets involved in the Chinese exclusion, after the end of the Civil War, is also they use the argument to say that this is the British sending coolie laborers. So those same Indian laborers, but it wasn't Indian, but it was also in Chinese. So in the US context, it was really used against the Chinese, saying we don't want coolie laborers to come in to the country because they still were getting cheap labor from African Americans who were not given the full rights they were supposed to get after the end of the Civil War and the failure of the Reconstruction.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We're about 25 minutes in, so I guess I wanted to ask you one last question, and it's
Uh-huh.
kind of like a current event.
Mhm.
You kind of touched on it earlier, but okay, recently Joe Biden stepped down. Kamala Harris, she's running for president. She's already been the first woman vice president, first black vice president, first Indian vice president, first Asian. The list goes on, and she's possibly going to do that again by you having a chance to live in India, live in America. Is she viewed as an Indian president in America? Is she famous, or is that something that a lot of people they just not aware of?
In India, partly because, in US news is news everywhere, all across the world, in this way that, news from other parts of the world is not so much news in the US. So the rise of Kamala Harris and the rise of a lot of Indian diaspora elsewhere has been followed very closely by the Indian media. So Kamala Harris, in a way, is not the first. So the last British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he was also of Indian descent. So there was a lot of excitement about that. Now, of course, a lot of excitement about Kamala Harris and the village from where her mother came and her grandparents lived. They are, completely celebrating this whole development of Kamala Harris's emergence as the Democratic Party's nominee. So it is really big, and her family comes from people. Her grandparents were very active in the Indian anti-colonial movement, so they were well-known people in the Indian context. And then her mother, who came as a student here to the United States, was very active in the civil rights movement in the United States, and she was, in fact, she really grew up. Kamala Harris really grew up within an African American community more than she did in the Indian diaspora community, because her mother was quite a sort of somebody who was charting out her own path. She wasn't the standard Indian immigrant who came to the United States. So, in many ways, her rise to fame is being watched and monitored very carefully in India. She's also, by the way, named after, and that's what I think. I don't think I've read it anywhere for sure, but given her family history and her mother's sense of civil rights and her parents' sense of anti colonialism, um, Kamala Devi was a very prominent Indian feminist who was one of the first women to stand for elections in India in the 1920s when the British finally allowed that to happen. And she's somebody I've written about in my second or third book, Spectres of Mother India. So I do think her name, Kamala Devi, is not accidental. It's probably an echo of Kamala Devi from India.
Wow, okay. That's interesting as well. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on the platform. It's definitely been a phenomenal episode. My mind is still processing the knowledge and the information that you shared, and I definitely look forward to the work that you have coming in the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Ty. I really enjoyed talking with you as well.
All right. Thank you too, and thank the viewers as well. Until next
Thanks,
time.
everyone.
Peace.
Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye.